Hello and welcome to another daily devotion. As this week we talk about and celebrate African American faith leaders, some of you whom you may have heard of, and some of you whom you may not have heard of. Today, I want to introduce you or reintroduce you to Philip Randolph, who was an African American Episcopalian AME church man, but also one of the most prominent leaders of the civil rights movement. He was really somebody who looked at our economic system, actually, and capitalism, and said, yeah, capitalism allows people to grow their wealth in a free market, but part of the shadow side of capitalism depends on cheap labor and how you get that cheap labor. And the danger, he said, was that if those with a lot of power aren't equitable or open or compassionate or fair with their workers, they can be perpetually held in poverty. And so he was one of the first people and the first person of color in the United States to organize a labor union for African Americans, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, where they would have strikes and sit-ins to get higher pay, much very similar to what some of our boycotts for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, for Wendy's and McDonald's did in the late 90s, early 2000s, and still is a work in progress. But to put pressure, organized pressure on the wealthy, those who are the CEOs and the management of companies to say, hey, and this is a problem today, right? We have CEOs giving themselves 400 times raises, and the everyday worker is getting nothing and actually is losing because of inflation. And Philip Randolph said, this isn't right. This isn't just. And so one of the two other things that Philip Randolph is greatly known for is the first, he petitioned the president, FDR at the time, and then also Harry Truman, to desegregate the military and to treat soldiers of color, whether Hispanic, African American, Asian, or Caucasian, to say all soldiers should be treated equally. There shouldn't just be black only platoons or Asian only platoons or white only platoons. But if these men and women are willing to give their lives, sacrifice for their country, they should be treated equally, paid equally, share the same barracks. And it wasn't until Randolph and that push that executive orders from the presidency changed the military and desegregated it in advance of our society desegregating. But finally, and maybe one of the most powerfully, when we think of the civil rights movement, we think of Martin Luther King Jr. and the I Have a Dream speech and the reflective pool. And that doesn't happen if it's not for Philip Randolph. Because Randolph was the one who led people to the March on Washington, March on D.C., organized people for power, and Martin Luther King Jr., and set up the venue so that speech could happen. There's always, if there's going to be a Peter, there always has to be an Andrew who's always working behind the scenes to make sure the rest of the disciples are fed, to make sure the rest of the disciples are on the move, to make sure they stay on task. Somebody who's continuing to push them forward and say, we've got work to do, guys. We're not done yet. Yeah, sure, James or John or Peter might be speaking, but you need the workhorses in there who are never going to give up, who are people of perseverance and whose convictions helps light the spark in others. And Philip Randolph was excellent at that. A tremendous disciple, a tremendous leader and organizer of civil rights, and a tremendous part of African American history and faith history that we should all be thankful for and aware of. In our own efforts to not be satisfied with the status quo and to make all God's children, in the words of the prophet, have their own fig tree, their own well for water, and a roof over their heads, and a shade tree, and no one will make them afraid anymore. Now, that work's not done yet. Randolph would say, we got to get to it.